situations, but they are basically the reproposition of an old debate. And often the new participants in the most current debate are not aware of that. And if they were aware of that, perhaps they might be able to avoid at least some of the polemical heat. I hear some feedback loop, so please check that your microphone is off. So they might be able to avoid some polemical heat, or they might avoid reducing the opponent's position to some cliche and try to understand them better. One example that is that comes to my mind about this is the polemics between Bill Easterly and on one side and Jeffrey Sachs on the other about development policies in less developed countries, and especially about the difference between what Easterly labeled as the approach of the searchers on one side and the approach of the planners on the other side. Easterly considered himself a searcher, someone who would go to the field, who would try through either randomized control experiments or specific analysis of a specific situation, whether a certain policy would work or not. The planner, in Easterly's excessively easy description of this character, is the one who thinks that it is enough to parachute a comprehensive plan heavily funded to change the fate of a less developed country or a region. This is a debate that was not particularly useful between Easterly and Sachs, and both protagonists didn't notice that they were rehearsing what had happened in the 50s between supporters of a project approach on one side and a program approach on the other side. And often these two approaches also intersected other discourses about balanced and unbalanced growth. So this is one point that, of course, we can elaborate, but I wanted to start with this. The fact that the history of development economics gives us a patrimony of ideas and shows to us how certain debates or certain policies have some common features to what has been already tried, and this kind of hall of mirror can help us make better sense of our current practices. A second point, which is apparently entirely in full opposition to this one, but it's not, is that the history of development economics also shows to us that actually different historical situations are, I'm using now a sentence that was dear to Albert Hirschman, unique constellations of elements. And the history of development economics shows these to us in two different ways. One is that we learn through the history of development economics, but not only just the theories, also the practice, all the many different cases. So since this is very much an applied field, learning from past experiences, other cases, is always very important. Another way that it shows to us the fact that development projects are often unique constellations of different elements emerges from our increasing awareness that some approaches or some policies were initially developed for very specific historical situations, very specific regions. And then they've been applied to other regions in other times without understanding that perhaps the institutional or the social or the political framework were different. And perhaps you've seen in the article that that you've read, the one that I published in Past and Present, Planning Peace, my attempt to show how policies that were initially designed to address the so-called underdeveloped problem of Central and Eastern Europe in the mid-20th century became the orthodox approach for early development economics, well beyond the borders of that specific region. And it is not, I mean, the lineage is not as simple as I'm putting it now, but the tendency to one-size-fits-all approaches often come out of this generalizing out of early experiences. Early doesn't mean necessarily experiences that date back to the 40s or the 50s, but previous experiences. So if on one side we can see that there is sort of a circularity in the debates in development economics, from another perspective, we grow increasingly aware of the uniqueness of each and every situation. One other element for practitioners and for scholars also who are very much interested in current debates is that a better understanding of past debates is very helpful for us to understand, to become more acquainted with the tools that we have today, analytical tools and practical tools. And one other point is that the history of development economics, if doesn't remain just the history of development analysis, but if we consider it as it is an applied field, also help us better understand the organizations that are involved in the development field. And this is very important because often we speak of these organizations, either NGOs or the multilateral organizations such as the IMF or the World Bank or regional development banks as actors in their own, but often very monolithical actors. We speak about the World Bank and the position or the policies of the World Bank. It is often interesting to see through the history of development economics how different actors within that big box, the black box of the World Bank. As you probably know, I've studied it for quite a while, but also other organizations. Different actors within that box have different ideas, often pursue different agendas. So there is a negotiation going on. The headquarters have often, or the position of the headquarters is not always exactly represented by country offices. At times, yes, but at times not at all. Different offices may struggle for different approaches and different styles of policy making. So this is another, I think, very important reason to study development economics, and a very important way for us to understand also what's going on in the development field today. And finally, there is the never-ending relationship and not linear relationship between the theory of development economics and the development practice. The practice of development policies, the policy-making processes, and so on. And of course, if you are working within a development agency, you perfectly understand what I'm speaking about, and you see these every day. But we can understand it also through the history of the discipline, and not necessarily the history of the 50s, but also from the history of periods closer to us. How theory often affects policy making, but also how policy making and practical problems often set the agenda for theoretical debates. And closing the circle, this is often what happens when we see these scholars or scholars/practitioners enter into huge debates, each one pursuing an apparently each of them pursuing mutually opposing agendas, theoretical agendas, but then when we look at what they are doing, or if they have an opportunity to work in the field, perhaps these theoretical debates are not entirely justified, or at least they exist in the journals, but they do not exist with the same clarity in the field. This is a tension that exists, and in order to understand this tension, we often tend to see the world, or let's say, see the academic approach as very distinct from the practitioner's approach. But this is a way for us to understand logically these approaches, but it's not the end of our reasoning. We should, at the end, bring them back together when it is possible, at least. For example, Paul Streeten, who was a prominent development economist, still active in the 70s and the late 80s, and the founder and first editor of the journal World Development, highlighted precisely this tension. The academy prizes the distinction of ideas, prizes the fact that we can make sense of several different approaches or theoretical differences, all the nuances, etc., etc. Often, the practice requires that we blur differences, that we look for compromises that are the opposite of highlighting all the differences, and so on. And since many development economists work both in the academy and in the field, this is a very good exercise. Okay, I've been speaking already too much in my opinion, so I would like to conclude this introduction by reading you the very last sentence of a very nice and short book by Albert Hirschman. Let's see if you can see it. It looks like my camera is not... okay, because it must be in front of me, because I'm blurring the thing. The passions and the interest. The passions and the interest. No, I'm not sharing slides. This is really a conversation. So this book was, you know, Albert Hirschman has been a development pioneer, but he also studied intellectual, the history of ideas about capitalism, the working of democracy. He was he's always been visiting Latin America, as you know. He's been in Colombia. So he was in this book, The Passions and the Interest, reflecting about capitalism in Europe between the 16th and the 18th century, but he was also thinking about development ideas. And he wrote, I conclude this book, that both critics and defenders of capitalism could improve upon their arguments through knowledge of the episode in intellectual history that has been recounted here. And more in general, I'm adding, we can learn and improve upon our arguments in development economics through knowledge of the intellectual history and the history of the policy making of development policies. I'm sorry for the this is probably all one can ask of history, and of the history of ideas in particular, not to resolve issues, but to raise the level of the debate. And Hirschman was also excessively modest there, not only raise the level of the debate, but hopefully raise the level of our awareness when we address development problems today. So I'll finish here, and I'd like very much to start a conversation with you. Those of you who speak are I mean, I'd be happy if you can switch your camera on, present yourself, because I see there are a lot of people I do not know, and I look forward to knowing you. So thank you for your patience, and let's move on.
Okay, thank you, Michele. Thank you, everyone. I don't know if we want to start like raising our hands, and as we mentioned before, if someone has issues in order to translate the question, we will be happy to help. So yeah, and I also invite you to turn on your cameras in order to know who you are and what are your interests. And I think that maybe I just want to give you, to some of you, a bit of the context. We are called ReDe. We are a reading group, but also we are going beyond the reading group. So we have this session with the students, with economics students, in order to go beyond the current curriculum in development. So we were reading, when Michele was mentioning that we were discussing before, is because with the students we were reading one of his papers and one paper by by Arturo Escobar, and we were discussing a bit the history of economic development. This is information for all of you who maybe were not aware that we were in this context, but more than welcome to ask your questions. Yeah, so raise your hand and we can help you with the, yeah. Or if I don't know if Isabella is there, because we had prepared some questions in order to our discussions with the students. So I don't know if Isabella has good network and reception to talk, or maybe I can pass the questions. Isabella?
Hi. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Sorry for the inconveniences. Yes, we have some like opening questions because actually we believe that, for example, in one of your papers, the Kindle call principle is a very interesting topic that you pass on briefly in your explanation. I would like to ask you about how this Kindle call principle um, behaves, or is something that we can see in academia, and it is the same thing that we see in the political arena. They served for the same purpose, or maybe in academia, the Kindle principle at the end is a tool for something. I would like you to explore something about that. And my second question, I'm just picking some interesting topics. And my second question, which is actually no, I don't want to put you on a political debate, but I will like to ask you about, for example, you are an expert of the World Bank history. I want you to know, I want you to explain us or talk to us about perhaps the implications of the new World Bank head, as a person who's now like for the United States. It's a different role from the World Bank. In the light of the history of the World Bank, how do you see these changes? Those are my two pick questions, just to open the debate. As I say, not especially political debate, but we are here an academic and a historian debate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Isabella, for these questions. And I see there is a question in the chat. So let me read that as well. How do you break the path dependency of development thinking? What is the role of the colonizing movement in critical thinking? From Francis Kuriakose. Thank you very much, Francis. This is probably the, I mean, this is a very difficult question. And Karen, okay, thanks, Karen. So we have three questions. One is the Kindle call principle, or kindling the call. It is this is an expression that comes from a debate between any I'm missing the name of one of the most important intellectuals of the entire modern science. The one who had an apple falling on his head and therefore understood
Newton.
Newton. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, that kindling the call comes from an old debate between Newton and another guy about who had preeminency in discovering a certain principle, and it is something that has been at the basis of a wonderful book by sociologist of knowledge, Robert K. Merton, who was the father of the Robert Merton, the economist, the Nobel laureate, I think. so Merton, the father, was using these. Yes, was using this idea of this image of kindling the coal when two academicians start discussing about preeminence, about who came first to a certain idea and who deserves the merit for making a certain statement or giving the name to a certain principle, etc., etc. And at that point, the debate becomes more interesting, at least as a sociological or ethnographic field of inquiry than interesting per se because of its contents. It becomes more a fight between strong personalities than a conversation to understand some I don't want to use the word truth, but let's say some realities that we can observe around us. So that is an interpretive perspective for us to try to understand how debates take shape. And of course, it doesn't happen only in the academia, although the academia is a very good place to see this fight between oversized personalities. It happens also perhaps not really between individuals in organization, often between organizations that sacrifice fruitful collaboration for the sake of visibility. So we don't have to do we don't have to take that principle as something particularly innovative. Actually, we have seen and we have observed this kind of behaviors also in our life, I'm pretty sure. But it is a good interpretive lens to understand or to try to understand whether a debate is has any substance or has become just a matter of personalities, of a matter of pride more than substance. I'm also having a look at the chat.
If you want, Michele, we are happy to translate whenever you are ready to answer the other questions. We can translate the questions for you, the questions that are in the chat.
Okay, so I can read the Spanish. I can't speak it. Oh wow. Perhaps you can make a summary of these comments. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would spend more time reading the chat than answering to the comments. In any case, coming to the World Bank. We don't have to be afraid of political questions, also because if we want to study and observe these organizations, we have to look at them as political actors. Clearly, the last three presidents of the World Bank have had an agenda that is not particularly concerned with the downsizing of this organization in the global development stage. Often Republican administrations in the US, and the US, of course, is the most important shareholder at the bank, still with the veto power. Often Republican administrations have prioritized bilateral lending to multilateral lending, though I'm saying often. This has happened often with the Republican administration, but in any case, not only with Republican administrations. And therefore, in this case, in all these cases, the role of the World Bank for its major shareholder has been that of an organization that should be not excessively independent and with not an excessive amount of resources. So the last president is very much in line with the previous one, Zöllig, and with the previous one as well. You may remember that Wolf, Wolfson, what was his name? Today I have a problem with names. In any case, the one who had to resign because he had a love affair with the secretary, he made it clear he he's a neoconservative. He made it clear that were it for him, he would have seen the World Bank as a bank that would stop making loans and just disbursing grants to less developed countries. And this, of course, may seem very interesting because a loan requires repayments, whereas grants are just gifts. But this also would mean that the bank would lose entirely its financial independence. Because, of course, if there are no longer loans that have to be repaid, and the bank has no longer this kind of independence in its relationship with borrowing countries, all the funds would come from replenishments. Therefore, new funds that the major shareholders would give the bank. And we've seen in the history of the bank, since the establishment of its affiliate IDA, the International Development Association, the so-called soft window loan, soft loan window of the bank, that actually gives grants or loans at a very, very low interest rate and very long-term repayment to the poorest member countries. Every time that a replenishment for IDA was needed, a lot of strings would be attached to the bank. What I'm trying to say, that the bank is clearly not immune from political influences and especially from the political steering of its major shareholders. But depending on the historical situation and depending on the presidents, also the personality of the president and the top management that different presidents have been able to build, the bank has been more or less independent from direct political intervention, more or less independent in shaping its own policies, more or less independent in prioritizing loans for certain sectors or others. So there is no easy recipe here, but clearly presidents that see the bank as a smaller institution, not particularly ambitious, and perhaps an institution that is going to lose its weaken its financial independence, are showing a political agenda that is clearly very connected to the agenda of the most important shareholders of the bank. There are many other things that could be discussed about politics at the bank. I mean, you've seen that small adjustments have been done to its membership, but still we live in I mean, the president is still a US citizen as it was 70 years ago. And even when very prominent and prepared candidates were available, and now Jose Antonio Campo comes to my mind, there was no possibility for them to become presidents of the bank. So we can and we must see and study how independent this institution can be from direct political intervention, still always within the framework of the post-Bretton Woods world.
Michele, I think that you're mute now.
Okay. I don't know. I hope I've been muted for just a couple of seconds.
Yeah, just a couple of seconds. Don't worry.
All right. All right. So, can you summarize me other questions that have been put forth? There was another one I now don't remember.
There was one that you read already, that it was the question about the break the path dependency of development thinking. What is the role of the colonizing movement in critical thinking, by Francis Kuriakose. That was the one that you read already, and then Isabella can summarize the other ones.
Yes.
I can't hear Isabella.
Oh man. Isa? Well, I think that we have some network issues, so let me go ahead and there are two questions that are related with the World Bank and multilateral institutions topic. So one of these is by Julie, and Julie is asking, like, in general, what is the role of these multilateral institutions in the history of development? If you can, like, I think that you already answered that question in the sense of the World Bank, but she's asking if this intervention of these institutions has been positive or negative. And there is another question about this. Let me find it.
Can you hear me?
And there is also Maria Bach who raised her hand.
Yeah, and also, but there is, I will just read one more related with this topic of international organizations, and it's by Vanessa Ospina, and she's asking that how do you reconcile the development vision and priorities of donors, financiers, and government, and the local perspectives communities? And she is asking particularly one situation that we have currently in Colombia, that we want to build a port by the Pacific coast, but the place where they want to build this port, this place is like a natural reserve, and some local communities apparently they don't like that much the idea. So she's asking like this, could you reconcile the donors and the government idea with the local communities? I think that those questions are related, and then I can read the other ones.
All right. Maria, do you want to intervene?
Yes, hi, Michele. Thank you for that great introduction. I mean, my question is a little bit different from these questions, so I think handle that and then I can ask mine.
All right. Okay, thank you. Yes, these are, let me try to answer with, to give just one answer to all these questions that have to do with the politics of multilateral organizations in relation to the realities of developing regions. And of course, please be patient with me if I'm going to simplify things. Because we don't have the time to be excessively or not excessively actually to be as precise as we should. These organizations in general have been important, very important actors in shaping the development field from the late 40s on. And for those of you who have read the chapter by Escobar, Encountering Development, you've seen that there is a critique that puts together these organizations and in general the development discourse as a form of a Western ideological and not only ideological but also a Western imperialism in the field in beyond ideology, also in the shaping and production of knowledge and also the self-perception of local communities. Escobar is trying to go beyond these, giving agency also to local communities. This discursive approach, of course, is very interesting from the perspective of critical thinking. Is at the same time, it is to me somehow detached from the policies and from the practice of development. Even if Escobar is saying that he tries to roots his analysis specifically in the policies, but I don't find in that kind of analysis any solution to the fact that there are regions where let's say there are problems of potable water or regions where there are health problems that must be addressed somehow. It's not only a discursive dimension. It's not only something that comes out of our mind and shapes the world, though of course we are all Kantian in that sense. We have the categories of space and time and we can build on them. So these organizations have been shaping the practice and the discourse of development, and they have grown through a rather linear path for the first 30 years of their life, let's say irrespective of the debates that were going on at the more theoretical level. They were disbursing loans, focusing on regional or more specific projects, and the theoretical debates, as I said already, were important in shaping certain policies, but also were not the major element framing those policies. Today, the world is changing quickly. The World Bank is not that important as it was before. There is the sort of a World Bank built up, established by China and several other Asian countries, to which also several European countries are participating. They're making the US furious for this because, of course, it is a shift of power and negotiating power. And before that, there were several regional development banks were established. And in the last 30 years, sovereign funds have also become particularly important. That is, funds that belong directly to specific countries, and they are financially very, very powerful. So bilateral lending has been growing and is now much more important than it was before. Multilateral lending is still alive, but is shifting its centers of power. The World Bank remains an important organization, but is no longer the only one, and others are emerging. How this complex system has worked is something that we should discuss much more at the micro level, in a sense. It's very difficult to summarize these. So perhaps instead of answering directly these, we should, it might be helpful to highlight a few elements that have become important, at least for the most interesting, to me, the most interesting scholars and practitioners of development. One is that from early, strong and solid certainties about development policies, the role of uncertainty as an intrinsic element of the development debate is important. And I think that we often find the most nuanced and interesting analysis in scholars that understand and recognize uncertainty as not just one variable among others, but as an element that characterizes the landscape. Development knowledge, as a consequence, is something that is not, can't be considered similar to physical assets. It's a capital. You know that Wolfenson called the World Bank a knowledge bank, much more than a bank made of financial capitals. But a knowledge bank is, in some important respects, a misleading definition, because it gives the idea that we can accumulate a wealth of knowledge and then use it. Instead, scholars like Judith Tendler, Albert Hirschman, and several others, Danny Roderick more recently, have underscored the fact that development knowledge is shaped by the dialogue and the conversation between donor and borrower. These are two different roles. Of course, the power leverage of these of the different actors is different because of these different roles, but it's only through an actual collaboration between the two poles of the conversation that useful development knowledge can emerge. And another thing that has been increasingly important from the 80s on, at least in the global development discourse, is attention to grassroots movements and the role of local communities. The World Bank at that time was not particularly attentive to these, but scholars were already highlighting these. Also some foundations in the US, some more regional local foundations were starting to highlight the role of civil society, etc., etc. And again, that is something that is relatively new in the development debate, that was completely outside of the debate and the policy-making analysis, and must be at the core of the debate today. So just to give a very brief answer to that question earlier, local communities are, of course, crucial. I see. Okay, Maria, then also Anna. Anna raised her hand. Of course, if you want to follow up, tell me that you don't agree. I mean, it's you are welcome. Maria.
Yes, hi. I guess my question kind of links to this idea of the knowledge bank, because it is one that I've been thinking about a long time, looking at the history of development economics. Sorry about the background noise. Huh? He might
No
just want me to
problem.
so the idea that in development economics, more than any subdiscipline in economics, is that we have this distinction between theory and applied. And it's interesting because I just assumed that that was the case in all subdisciplines, and until I started talking to Béatrice Cherrier, and she said, no, I don't think that that's something that we do. And of course, Béatrice Cherrier knows a lot about a lot of the subdisciplines of economics. So I kind of took her word for it in a way. And so I wanted your opinion on that. Why is it in economics, that in development economics, that we distinguish between these two things? Because of course, as an historian of economics, I find it so difficult to distinguish these two things. I think everybody has a theory about how development occurs, how the economy works, even if you're doing applied work. So it's almost like if you don't talk about it, it's there in the back of your head and you just haven't dealt with it rigorously enough, but it's still something you do. Everyone has a theory about how they think the world works. Anton agrees.
Yes. I agree, especially with the last comment. Okay, Hannah, do you want to also make your comments or ask your questions so I can?
Yes. Hi. So I will just quickly ask the questions to avoid making too much time. So my question actually is not necessarily connected to that, but it is connected to another applied field. So maybe there's a relationship there. So for me, I was interested in your opinion on what role agricultural development and agricultural economists actually play when we look at the history of development. Because I mean, if you look at people, Maria knows this, like Wolf Ladeczynski, someone I've encountered in my work, who was working with the World Bank. These are the, especially in the early 50s and 40s, these are the people who do a lot of the groundwork for development, as a practitioner on a practical level. So that would be my question. What kind of role would you assign them in the discourse of history here?
Yes. Now, very, very interesting questions. So development economics was, and Maria here, for those who don't know her research, has been broadening these new horizons. The issue of development, of course, was not born in 1945. And the roots are go much back in time, and Maria's been working on India, especially an Indian economist. Correct me if I'm wrong, Maria, but I think that is...
That's right.
Yeah, the topic of your PhD research and several articles you've been publishing. At the same time, the discipline, I mean, if we look at the disciplinary field when it was institutionalized, and therefore a field with its own journals, with its teaching at the universities, etc., is very much a post-war discipline, a so-called Cold War social science, because it is in connection to the decolonization of what was called the Third World, that it is that process that gave the cue to economists to focus on development of less developed countries, and the funds went to think tanks, to departments, etc., and started to build a disciplinary field. So, in a sense, it is a reaction to the process of decolonization, and a reaction to the new exigencies, to the new needs of the two superpowers to fight their battle at the periphery of the world. This also perhaps it gives an answer to a question that was asked before. These origins means that many economists approached the new questions building it from scratch. And often they were a pretty new generation of economists who had cut their teeth in the Marshall Plan, in reconstruction, in programs of economic reconstruction after World War II, and therefore they had a very applied bent from the very beginning. At the same time, as an intellectual project, this early generation of economists started to think that it is not enough just, let's say, to go to the third world and try to work out how things, how to establish a banking system or trigger some industrial development, but that the conditions of these countries are so different in many respects that standard economic theory should be recast in important ways to be effective. So that was also the intellectual project that actually came after they started to work on this. A little bit together, but they became aware of this during the 50s. And there are very interesting documents by Ken Galbraith, Albert Hirschman, and others who spoke about this intellectual project. Then this project as an intellectual project collapsed. Today, the development field is very alive, and there are books that are very successful books also in the trade departments of bookstores, if you still go physically to a bookstore. But I mean, Danny Roderick himself has a very successful blog, etc., etc. But it's interesting that Danny Roderick, who's one of the most sophisticated development economists today, in 2007 published a book whose title is One Economics, Many Recipes. And he opens the book by saying this book is heavily rooted or strongly rooted in mainstream economics, in neoclassical economics. Then what differentiates me from my colleagues is that I think I have a stronger attention to the specific context, and therefore I think that this standard and universal theoretical core must be adapted to different situations. But there is one economics as there is one physics. Albert Hirschman wrote several decades earlier, no, there is not one economics as there is one physics. The Keynesian revolution made it clear already that the claim of just one economic core that could be adapted to different situations was untenable. And even more so for countries like these new countries that are emerging from the decolonizing process and the new discipline of development economics. So there was always an applied dimension, an intellectual and therefore a theoretical project that was initially thrived. It triggered the enthusiasm of many people, but then faded away. And today's economists are no longer interested in establishing their discipline as a theoretically different discipline. The irony of this is that Danny Roderick, for that book, was awarded the Alberto Hirschman Prize of the Social Science Research Council. But I mean, it makes sense for his role in development economics. Now, coming to I see. I don't know if I will be able to address them as you would deserve it, but the role of agrarian economist on one side that Hannah highlighted, and the tension between applied and theoretical, the applied and the theoretical side of the highlighted by Maria, are very much connected. Precisely because of these different experiences that I try to briefly describe, the theoretical and the practical dimension have always been felt as two poles of an unresolved relationship. But then also I think at least this is something that post-developmental critique doesn't address. Often policies have been, I mean, there is another element in addition to ideology and politics and political interest or geostrategic interest that frame and shape policy making, developmental policy making, which is the actual situation in a specific place or a region. So, of course, there are decisions that are being made about whether one country should develop a railway system or a system of highways and trucks transportation instead of railway transportation, or whether to build a new port in one region or somewhere else. But then often there is a geography that shapes choices. There is a politics that doesn't come from the big donors and the shareholders, but the local political landscape that often puts important constraints to the choices that can be made. There are other constraints due to the availability or not of natural resources and so on. And so my point in that tension between theory and practice is that often the local situation, I don't want to simplify this excessively, but often when we analyze these, we tend to highlight excessively, in my opinion, the theoretical dimension, the agency of all actors, and forget that then they struggle to do something in the field. And this is, to me, the most realistic explanation of why scholars who have extremely opposed theories about development, how things happen, then when they become the advisors or responsible for something that must be done in practice, they speak with the same vocabulary, they use the same terms, they address the same problems, they perhaps they are at variance about certain aspects of a project, but not necessarily the entire project either, even. So they speak, they are much closer than we would expect. Why it is this? Because there are, let's say, physical and local constraints that shape our and constrain our agency. This is one thing. As for the agricultural practitioners, they also belong to, I mean, they perhaps even more than those who would work on industrial development, often agricultural economists had to face this kind of local constraints, or tried to revolutionize the local constraints by discussing the possibility of land reforms. And the interesting thing is that the United States have always been, always not, but often been in favor of land reforms. This quintessentially socialistic approach that we would imagine would not belong to the mind frame of an Eisenhower. Actually, the Eisenhower administration was not in principle against, precisely because that was often considered the only way to try to disentangle some of the political obstacles to any plan of agricultural development. But that was more on the, let's say, the policy-making side and the political side. Interestingly, agricultural economists, as far as, I mean, I'm not, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but they became a prominent voice only between the late 50s and the early 60s, when Schultz especially linked the issue of agriculture with the issue of human capital. But before that, as far as I know, I've seen development economics as shaped more by debates about industrialization or the development of a banking system, financial system, and the agricultural issue as a more political and practical issue, but not something that would trigger any theoretical contribution. I don't know, Hannah, if you agree with that.
To a certain degree, yes. I think that a lot of the people who could have contributed in a more specific way were actually working on the ground before the late 1950s. So they were working in administrations, just trying to help. And they, in general, the profession seems less interested in improving on the theoretical side, but actually using theory to apply and improve. I mean, that it's an applied science, so I guess that's why they are interested in theory, but they're not keen necessarily on developing a new one to a certain degree. But yeah, I think thank you. That answers some of my questions for answering this.
Sorry to interrupt. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, Maria, and your baby too. I want to announce that Maria will be our next speaker in the October's webinar. So we are really happy to having her here, and yeah, knowing this group. So we will have like around 10 minutes because we start a bit late. So I just want to, Michele, if you allow me to summarize two of we have three
Yes.
questions here in the chat.
And I
One,
see there is also
I use my
another
hand, I
hand.
think.
Ah, sorry. Yeah,
Sorry.
that's your hand.
So hi, Habeich, he's asking what should prioritize when you are when you are in the decision making process, like quantitative or qualitative tools. And there are two other related questions, and one of these is like what we can learn from China and how those type of lessons we can apply here in Latin America. This is a question by Juan Pablo. And there is another question by Ivan Urrea, and he's asking, like more generally speaking, about the challenges for Latin America, and yeah, and how we could like solve this economic and political chaos, because as you know, we are like in this uprising moment. So he's asking in general what we can do about it. So yeah, so those are there is one last question, and she is asking, I think that she's asking about the randomized trial control, because well, okay, she's talking about the rise of randomization many years ago, and to what extent international institutions had been committed with this major shift in development economics, and was there interest for doing so? I think, yeah, she's asking about RCTs and what this emerged and why everyone is so interested in impact evaluation and RCTs now. So those are the four questions, and I think that we will close questions now because otherwise we won't be able to finish at the time. So thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you very much for these last round of questions. Again, very, very interesting. As for the first one, quantity versus quality, I wouldn't put it that way. I think this is in some way sort of a false opposition. We need quantity and we need quality. We need quantitative analysis and we need qualitative analysis. Another way to, let's say, to address what at least I imagine is behind this question is the fact that the conundrum of this development knowledge. I mean, on one side, we must recognize there is a uncertainty everywhere, and there is a specificity for each situation, a unique constellation of elements, as I said before. So in this sense, it is as if we should start from scratch every time. And this is impossible and also not very intelligent. At the opposite side is the one-size-fits-all approach. We know what to do, we do and apply that everywhere. And of course, and we've seen it doesn't work. So there is this tension that has to do with learning new things, doing things through organizations, large or small, doesn't matter, but organizations need routinization because they can't reinvent themselves every day. At the same time, routinization can't hinder innovative thinking, experimenting with new ideas, building a dialogue in specific contexts. So there are elements that will never find a balance. And quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis will never find a restful balance, an equilibrium at rest. It will be always an unbalanced equilibrium between these different needs. that we have as members of organizations, and I'm speaking now of organizations in the broadest possible way. I mean, state or non-state organization, multilateral, bilateral, grassroots, bottom-up or top-down ministries. It doesn't matter, but somehow this kind of debates pull us or are made of very different inputs that participate into them. So perhaps I didn't answer precisely to this quantity versus quality, but hopefully I complicated that question a little bit. Let's say that the quantity alone is clearly technically stupid. Quality alone can help us exercise our mind, but we also need information, which is often in the shape of, let's say, quantitative data, though not always. The randomized trial, the RTCs have become, as you've seen, very fashionable. They also earned Esther Duflo and the MIT group a Nobel Prize. They are a very micro approach, which is fine to understand how to address and to solve specific problems in certain areas, but they no longer, I mean, they do not address at all other issues that have to do with the political dimension of a country, with the social change. I'm not saying that we should have theories to go and change the society of a country, but there is not even the recognition that a social dimension exists, except then within the borders of the randomized trial controls. So it has these RTCs techniques have been working in some cases, but they have their structural limits. And the World Bank has been using it, but without much of enthusiasm. Angus Deaton, another Nobel laureate, has been putting forward important critiques towards RTCs. And if you have a quick search on the internet, you will find an important debate about that. As for China and Latin America, since we are running out of time, and this is a very important topic and very long, let me take a shortcut and redirect you to the writings of Kevin Gallagher. Let me write his name in the chat. Kevin Gallagher at Boston University, who's written a very important book on China and Latin America, published by Oxford University Press not long ago, perhaps a couple of years ago. And from there, you will find a lot of material. I would like to add one thing, that I'm very glad that this seminar is so participated, and I don't know most of you, but you are all invited to get in touch with me if you want to discuss something, or move on with this conversation. And I want to reiterate my thanks to Camilla, Isabella, Yvonne, and the entire ReDe group for your invitation. Thank you.
No, thank you, Isa. Isa was the organizer, Isabella, but she was having problems today with the network. So I don't know if Isa wants to say something. From my side and my colleagues, we are so happy. I think that our students were enjoying it a lot. We had the translation simultaneously thanks to Nicolas, who was like translating you at the same time. So,
Poor Nicolas.
yeah.
Nicolas.
Yeah, he was translating. So yeah, thanks Nicolas and Alvaro for helping us. And Isa, I don't know what do you want to say?
Alvaro, of course.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank God. No, I just wanted to thank you, Michele. Thank you, the HIPT group, our partners in the Young Scholar Initiative Network, and everybody in the Los Andes Nacional and some other universities in Colombia. We are happy to have you here as our first guest, and we look forward to engage more in these discussions in our study group and have Maria back in our Dr. Maria back in our next seminar in October, I think. So we are eager to continue reading your work, discussing about it, and not taking one side, as you said, but keep our minds in a discussion mood. That's what we love and what we like. Thank you very much thank you really for your time and your kindness to all of us. And the
My pleasure.
participants, thank you very much.
Okay, bye. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye
in
to all.
Other places in the world. Gracias a todos en Colombia.
Gracias a ti, Cami, gracias a todo el equipo. Un abrazo grande.
Thank you, Michele.
Bienvenidos a los siguientes seminars. You are all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Chao. A ver. Allá está Pedro, ya se están yendo todos. Michele,
Ana.
thank you
Oh,
very
Camila.
much. It was amazing. I think that the problem is that we had many questions because actually we had more. And I think that everyone wants to get a grasp from your knowledge and all the things that you were talking about. So yeah, I think the time was not enough, but I think that we got a really good idea of all the things that you were mentioning, and I think that we will discuss it broadly in the reading group. So thank you very much, Michele.
Well, I'm glad I could contribute to this. Again, I thank you so much for this. It was great for me as well.
Thank you so much. We have more than 70 participants, so it was super nice. We are so happy.
Actually, 80. There was a moment when there were 80.
Okay.
Make sure that you keep me in your mailing list so that
yeah, we're going to actually invite you to the next sessions, to the next webinars, because actually one of the topics is regarding one of the last questions, like the discussion between like qualitative, quantitative tools using for development, and actually we're going to debate about RCTs and all the impact evaluation, that trend to evaluate programs and projects of development. So you are more than welcome, of course, to the next sessions, and of course we're going to invite you and send you the first person.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Chao, Ivo. Chao todos.
Ciao.